نبينا وحبيبنا محمد وعلى آله وصحبه أجمعين. So in the last session, while commenting on this poem on Islamic morals and manners by Ibn al-Qawi rahmatullahi alayh, we talked about وَأَمْرَكَ بِالْمَعْرُوفِ وَالنَّهْيَ يَا فَتَى عَنِ الْمُنْكَرِ اجْعَلْ فَرْضَ عَيْنٍ تُسَدَّدِ على عالم بالحذر والفعل لم يقم سواه به مع أمن عدوان معتدي. We talked about the issue of al-amr bil-ma'ruf wal-nahy anil munkar, enjoining the good and prohibiting the evil. I think that's in the songs. So we talked about the issue of enjoining the good and prohibiting the evil. And the author, rahmatullahi alayhi, he's talked about the obligation of doing the enjoining of good and forbidding of the evil. And this duty, this task of al-amr bil-ma'ruf wa nahy al-munkar is one of the defining features of the ummah of Islam, as we talked about last session. It's one of the things that makes this ummah the best nation and the middlemost nation. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says in Surah Al-Imran, كنتم خير أمة أخرجت للناس تأمرون بالمعروف وتنهون عن المنكر وتؤمنون بالله. You are the best community ever raised for mankind. You encourage the good, you forbid evil, and you believe in Allah. So why are you the best? Because of these three components: encouraging the good, prohibiting the evil, and believing in Allah. And this enjoining of good and prohibiting of evil, as we said last session, is part of the duty of nasiha, sincerity and sincere advice we have towards each other. When we see our Muslim brothers falling short in their compliance and obedience to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, we advise them. We believe that Islam is the best way of life. And part of the way we implement that belief is that when we see others falling short in following that guidance, we try to rectify it because we want the best for those individuals, for those people. So the duty we talked about last session about al-amr bil-ma'ruf wa nahy al-munkar is an obligation. The majority view is the fard kifaya, is a communal obligation. But it becomes a fard ayn, an individual obligation, meaning each person is obligatory, it's obligatory upon each individual person when 3 or 4 conditions are met. Number 1, you have knowledge of the issue. You know about the issue. Number 2, no one else is there to perform the duty. Someone's falling short, and evil is being committed, Allah's law is being violated. No one else is there to perform that duty. And number 3, you feel safe from harm coming your way should you undertake that task. You feel safe from being harmed should you undertake that task. And number 4, that what you are doing in enjoying the good and prohibiting the evil does not result in a greater evil. It does not result in a greater harm. And lastly, we said this is the 4 conditions that have to be met in order to make this duty fard ayn, an individual obligation. But we also said there's actually a fard ayn level due on every single Muslim. And what is that? I can remember. Who was here last session? I don't know. Anybody was here last session. There's a fard ayn level. There's a level where every single Muslim has to fulfill, and it's an obligation upon every single Muslim in this duty of enjoining the good and prohibiting the evil. Any ideas? Is to hate it in your heart. When you see an evil being done, even if you can't say something, even if you can't do something, there's an obligation upon you to hate it in your heart. We cannot allow ourselves to become desensitized to evil. We cannot allow ourselves to become accustomed to evil. Right? We must, at the very least, hate it in our hearts. So that's a very brief summary of what we discussed last session. Today, inshallah, we're continuing the topic of enjoining the good and prohibiting the evil. And part of the duty of enjoining good and prohibiting evil, or falling under the duty of enjoining good and prohibiting the evil, is hijranu ahl al-ma'asi, is to boycott. Is to boycott certain categories of people when Islam requires it. When Islam requires it. Now, as a principle, we need to understand that as a principle in Islam, when it comes to Muslims, it is haram to boycott Muslims. it is haram to boycott Muslims. This is the general ruling of boycotting, hijran. It is haram to boycott Muslims. It goes against the basic moral code that Islam teaches about brotherhood, about sisterhood, about unity, about enjoining good towards each other, helping each other in good, and so on and so forth, right? So the basic principle, and we're going to talk about these evidences for this principle next week, inshallah, not this week, because the author talks about other issues first. The basic principle is that it is prohibited to boycott Muslims. And when we talk about boycotting Muslims, we mean cutting off from them. Cutting off from them altogether. Not interacting with them, not engaging with them, not even speaking with them, not even giving them salam. Right? Complete boycott. In Islam, as I said, the general ruling of boycotting is prohibited, but in some cases it can become recommended, in some cases it can become obligatory, in some exceptions, and I use the word exception carefully here because it is an exception to the rule. And it becomes recommended or obligatory in cases where we feel that taking such a course of action, of boycotting, will actually lead towards rectification. It will lead to the person who is being boycotted rectifying himself or herself. Or it leads to us being safe or saving ourselves from the evil of another person. Right. So this is boycotting when it becomes, the exceptions when it becomes allowed, recommended, or even obligatory. So the author starts by talking about when it's recommended and when it's obligatory, and then he moves on to talk about the general ruling about when it's prohibited. So he goes, وَحِجْرَانُ مَنْ أَبْدَى الْمَعَاصِيَ سُنَّةً وَقَدْ قِيلَ إِنْ يَرْدَعْهُ أَوْجِبْ وَقِيلَ عَلَى الْإِطْلَاقِ مَا دَامَ مُعْلِنًا وَلَاقِهْ بِوَجْهٍ مُكْفَهِرٍ مُرَبَّدٍ. He says, boycotting someone who is openly committing sin is a sunnah. Someone who is openly committing sin in public. He's not ashamed about his sin. He's not trying to hide it. He's not trying to. He's just doing it in front of everybody. وَقَدْ قِيلَ إِنْ يَرْدَعْهُ أَوْجِبْ. And another view is that if boycotting stops him from committing that sin, it becomes an obligation. وَقِيلَ عَلَى الْإِطْلَاقِ مَا دَامَ مُعْلِنًا. Another view is that it is obligatory to boycott such a person so long as he is openly committing that sin. وَلَاقِهْ بِوَجْهٍ مُكْفَهِرٍ مُرَبَّدٍ. And meet him and engage with him, or when you see him rather, show him a stern, harsh face. Show him a stern, harsh face. So here the author, rahmatullah alayhi, he's talking about someone who is openly committing sin. And he effectively says there's three opinions of the scholars about such a person. Number one, it's a sunnah. It's recommended to boycott such a person. Someone who's openly committing sin. The second view is, if you think that by boycotting him, he will stop committing his sin, then it becomes obligatory to boycott him. And the third view is that it's obligatory to boycott regardless, so long as he is openly committing sin. And when he sees you, you should show him a harsh face, a stern face, to make him feel that what he is doing is something wrong. That what he is doing is not worthy of a Muslim, and the Muslims cannot agree to such a behavior, such a behavior being displayed in public or shown in public. So he says, Ahlul Ma'asi, the people of sin. And when we're talking about people of sin, we're talking about someone who is committing a sin either in speech or in deed or in belief. In speech or in deed or belief. And actually, there are three categories of people we're going to talk about in the following lines of poetry. The first one is this: people are committing sin, either in speech or deed. The second category are people who commit bid'ah, people who commit innovation. They introduce new things into the religion that have not been legislated by Allah and His Messenger. People are bid'ah. And the third category of people are those who have misguided beliefs. What they believe is wrong. What they believe is misguided. So the Muslims are either righteous, we're not talking about them here in this category, in this discussion, or those who commit sin, either in speech or deed. They're saying haram things, they're doing haram things. The second category of person is someone who is innovating, someone who has introduced new things in Islam that Allah or His Messenger ﷺ have not legislated. And the third category is those who are or have misguided beliefs, wrong beliefs. So in these two lines we talked about, we just quoted now, the author rahmatullah alayhi is talking about those who commit sin, i.e. they're doing something haram. They're not doing bid'ah, innovation, they're not committing shirk, they're not having misguided beliefs, they're just falling short. Allah has said don't do this, they're doing it. Allah is saying do this, they're not doing it. Right? They're committing haram, as many of us do. So the first category of person, how do we deal with this person who is committing sin? Before we actually even begin this discussion, we have to understand, and this is a very important point to understand, as Ibn Taymiyyah rahmatullah alayhi, many other scholars point out, that boycotting, when it's legislated in Islam, in those exceptional circumstances when it's legislated, it's an act of worship. It's an act of worship. It's not to be done to get a buzz. It's not to be done to make ourselves feel better than someone else, feel superior to someone else. That's not the goal of boycotting. The goal of boycotting is done for the sake of Allah as an act of worship, for the purpose of bringing back that brother or sister in Islam to the truth. That's what the goal of boycotting is. Ibn Taymiyyah says, therefore whoever boycotts because of his desires, or boycotts in a way not legislated in Islam, he is falling outside of what Allah and His Messenger have commanded. And then he says, and how many people are there who boycott thinking they are obeying Allah, but in reality they are following their lusts and desires. They're justifying their own lusts and desires, they're justifying their own hawa through the act of boycotting. They think they're doing it for Allah and His Messenger, but in reality they're doing it for their own ego, to make themselves feel better than someone else. Because how many people are there like this? And truly, how many people are there like this? Over the last few decades, we've seen plenty of examples, hundreds of examples where people think or claim they're boycotting for the sake of Allah, but in reality it's just for their own egos. Waliyadu billah. So the people of sin, boycotting them. The Prophet ﷺ said, "Inna awwala ma dakhala an-naqsu ala bani Israel." The first deficiency in religion, the first deficiency or defect that appeared amongst the Bani Israel, the children of Israel, is that a man would meet another person who's committing sin openly and say, fear Allah. Stop doing what you're doing because this is not lawful to do. Stop doing what you're doing because this is not lawful to do. And then he would meet him the next day and find no change in him. He's still openly committing that sin. But this will not prevent him from eating with him and drinking with him and sitting with him. And when it came to this, Allah led their hearts into evil on account of their association with others. So here, what is the Messenger of Allah telling us? That he's openly committing sin, but you're still sitting with him, you're still engaging with him, you're still being friendly with him, right? And when this happened, Allah punished these people. When this happened, Allah punished these people. This is one of the hadith that show us the legislation of boycotting, i.e. not to sit with someone, not to eat with someone, not to drink with someone. So it becomes recommended or an obligation, as some scholars said, in the case where you believe it will stop him from committing that sin. In the case where you believe, and this is a judgment call at the end of the day, and you would, perhaps take advice from people of knowledge. In the case where you believe that it will not stop him, in fact it may even encourage him to do more evil, then in this case boycotting is not legislated. In this case boycotting is not legislated. And in the world we're living in today, and it's really, I think personally it's really important for us to understand this, in the world where we're living in today, in the society where we're living in today, where people have so many avenues of evil open to them, and so many groups of people calling to evil and inviting to evil and making it seem friendly and inviting. If we were to boycott Muslims, you'd be very, very careful, because it's very easy for them to run into the arms of those other people. They have so many avenues now today they did not have in the past. So if you want to boycott people, you'd be very, very careful. The last thing you want them to be doing is, as a reaction to his Muslim community or her Muslim community boycotting them running to a community of evil. A community that is welcoming them and embracing them and then inviting them to the evil that they're doing. We have to be extremely careful of this. So this is the case of a person who's openly committing evil. What of the case of a person who does sin, but he does so in private? The author goes on to say, وَيَحْرُمُ تَجْسِيسٌ عَلَى مُتَسَتِّرٍ بِفِسْقٍ وَمَادِي الْفِسْقِ إِذْ لَمْ يُجَدِّدِ. It is haram to spy upon someone in what he does in private. For the sins he does in private. It's haram to spy on a person to find out what he does in private. And likewise, it's haram to spy on a person or to apply these rulings to a person who committed sin in the past and then stopped doing it, repented from it. He committed sin in the past and then stopped. It's haram to apply these sort of rulings to that person or to spy on such a person as well. As a principle, again, it is prohibited for us to spy upon Muslims, i.e. to try to find out their private affairs, to look into their houses, to look over the fence into their gardens, to look through their windows, to look through their door, to the letterboxes or whatever. It's haram to spy. Haram to spy upon Muslims. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says, يَا أَيُّهَا الَّذِينَ آمَنُوا اجْتَنِبُوا كَثِيرًا مِنَ الظَّنِّ إِنَّ بَعْضَ الظَّنِّ إِثْمٌ. O you who believe, avoid most suspicion. Indeed, some suspicion is sinful. وَلَا تَجَسَّسُوا. And do not spy on each other. Do not spy on each other. وَلَا تَجَسَّسُوا. And in fact, as the Salaf used to say, the exact opposite is legislated by Allah for us. Ibn Abbas radiallahu anhuma, Allah has prohibited Muslims having bad thoughts and suspicions about other Muslims. Umar ibn Khattab, think only well of a word that leaves your brother, your believing brother, so long as you find a way to understand it in a good way. Try to find excuses, try to understand it. Abu Qilaba, he said, if something of your brother is conveyed to you that you dislike, that you find despicable, detestable, do your best to find an excuse for him. Even if you cannot find an excuse, you can't find a way out for what's been conveyed to you, say to yourself, perhaps he has an excuse that I'm not aware of. Perhaps there's a way of understanding this sentence that I can't understand. That's beyond me. This is the extent that we try to make excuses and not try to find ways and avenues to, or open that door towards having bad thoughts about our Muslims, which then opens the door towards spying upon Muslims. Allah, the Messenger of Allah sallallahu alayhi wa sallam said, وَلَا تَجَسَّسُوا وَلَا تَحَسَّسُوا. Don't spy and don't secretly listen into private conversations. Again, part of spying, according to one interpretation of this word. Don't spy and don't secretly listen in to private conversations. Don't go out hunting for the faults and secrets of your brothers and sisters in Islam. Be content with what you see of them on the outside. Take what, as the scholars used to say, as Ahlul Sunnah do say, take what is apparent from Muslims and leave what Allah has concealed. Take what is apparent from Muslims and leave what Allah has concealed. One time, a man was brought before Abdullah ibn Mas'ud radiallahu anhu, because it seemed to that individual who brought him to Abdullah ibn Mas'ud that his beard was smelling of wine. His beard was smelling of wine. And so Ibn Mas'ud said,
we have been prohibited from spying on Muslims. We have not seen him publicly drinking alcohol. What he does in private, we have been prohibited from spying on them. But if something is clear to us, if it becomes apparent, then we punish him for it. Then we punish him. So he's saying, okay, if it's apparent, if he's doing it openly, we punish him. But right now we have no evidence. Right now, it could be we have no proof, and neither are we required to go and hunt and spy on him to find out if there's proof or not. So وَيَحْرُمُ تَجْسِيسٌ عَلَى مُتَسَتِّرٍ. It is haram بِفِسْقٍ وَمَادِ الْفِسْقِ إِذْ لَمْ يُجَدِّدْ. It is haram to spy upon someone who is privately committing sin, or someone who committed sin in the past and then stopped, repented and stopped. Then the author goes on to say, وَحِجْرَانُ مَنْ يَدْعُ لِأَمْرٍ مُضِلٍ أَوْ مُفَسِّقٍ احْتِمْهُ بِغَيْرِ تَرَدُّدِ على غير من يقوى على دحض قوله ويدفع إضرار المضل بمذود ويقضي أمور الناس في إتيانه ولا هجر مع تسليمه المتعود. And he says, there's absolutely no doubt about the legislation of boycotting someone who is inviting towards misguidance or inviting towards sin. So the previous people were talking about someone who's committing sin openly or committing sin privately. Now we've got the next category of person. Someone who's actually calling to it, inviting people towards it. Either misguidance, either innovation, or even sin. He's openly calling people towards that evil. The author says there's no doubt about the obligation to boycott this individual. There's no doubt about the obligation to boycott this individual. على غير من يقوى على دحض قوله. With the exception, who doesn't boycott this individual or such a person? A person who is able to expose his evil. He has the knowledge and the ability to argue with that person, to debate with that person, to show that person to show that reality of that person to the other people. So he says everybody should be boycotting such a person, except for that person who has that knowledge and that ability to counter him, to take him to task, to debate with him even, and expose his misguidance, expose his deviation, expose his innovation, expose the fact that he's calling towards sin. And he's able to وَيَدْفَعُ إِضْرَارَ الْمُضِلِّ بِمِذْوَدِهِ. He's able to prevent his harm with a firm, stern tongue. So this is one exception from, he says, this obligation to boycott such a person. Another exception, وَيَقْضِي أُمُورَ النَّاسِ فِي إِتْيَانِهِ. Also exempted from this is such a person, he may be calling towards evil, he may be calling towards misguidance, but he has something that the people need. And there's no other way of getting that thing apart from via him. In which case you have to approach him, because the greater good lies in getting that thing that is needed for the people. Say for example he controls the water supplies in an area. Say for example he controls the food supplies in an area. Say he controls something that people need. But he's a person of innovation. He's a person of misguidance. Again, the exception is you don't boycott him, because this will lead to harming the Muslim as a whole, as a community. So where boycotting such an individual will lead to a greater harm to the Muslims, then boycotting is not legislated, as we talked about earlier. وَلَا هَجْرَ مَعَ تَسْلِيمِهِ الْمُتَعَوِّدِ. And he concludes by saying that also included, pretty much he's saying the meaning of which is, also included in this boycotting is, you don't even give him salam. You don't even reply to Islam either. And there is some difference of opinion here amongst scholars, but this is what the author here is saying. So, these are the general principles. Again, I'm using the word general, it's very important to understand I'm using the word general. When is it recommended? The general ruling here is haram to boycott Muslims. In some cases, it becomes a recommendation or an obligation to boycott an individual. And what is that case? Who can remember what is that case? when a person is committing sin, right? When a person is committing sin openly. And in some cases, it becomes an obligation to boycott that individual. When is that? When does it become an obligation?
What else to do?
That's enjoying the good, prohibiting the evil. Yeah.
When they're calling to it.
When they're calling to sin, or to innovation, or to misguidance. When they're calling to it, it becomes an obligation to boycott such an individual. However, that's the general ruling. But when it comes to boycotting, there's a number of principles you have to bear in mind. Boycotting is not something that's easy to do, and it's not a conclusion that's easily reached either. I.e., the conclusion that we should now boycott this individual is something that's not reached easily, and we have to truly understand this. Because, as I said, it's haram as a principle to boycott Muslims. For us to overcome that prohibition, there has to be an overwhelming reason to do so, determined by the Sharia. So, before we make the decision that such a person must be boycotted, we have to go through a number of steps in our minds, or with people of knowledge, and ascertain whether these steps are met or not, whether these conditions are met or not. Certain principles we have to apply. The first principle is this person calling to sin, calling to innovation, calling to misguidance or not? Right. So you have to determine what category does this person fall in. A person who is committing sin is not the same level of severity as a person who is calling to sin. A person who is committing bid'ah, innovation, is not the same level of severity as a person who is calling to bid'ah as an innovation. Right? You have to determine that first. The second thing, we have to make a judgment call on the effects of boycotting on that individual. Will it lead to his rectification, or will it make him worse? Will it make him worse, or will it cause even more evil to spread in society? We need to determine this. And all of these principles, by the way, are brought together from different words from Ibn Taymiyyah in his 𝐁𝐨𝐲𝐜𝐲𝐬 and other works, and Ibn al-Qayyim as well. So we have to look at the effects on the person. And if the harm outweighs the benefit for that person, then the boycotting should not be done, or may not be done. The length of time is the length of boycott. How long are you going to boycott him for? Is there a limit? And in these cases we're talking about, there isn't really a limit set by the Sharia. We'll talk about the limits of 3 days next week, inshallah. But as Ibn al-Qayyim says, the amount and the severity of the boycott and the length of the boycott should not be so much as to actually destroy the person. It's to ruin the person. Because he says the purpose is to discipline him, not to seal his fate. The purpose is to discipline that individual, not to seal his fate. So the third principle, the length of boycott. So the first three principles are what? Is he calling to innovation or sin, or is he just committing sin or innovation? What effect will a boycott have upon that individual? How long should that boycott be? Will the length of the boycott actually be of benefit or not of benefit? The fourth principle, the strength of 𝐻𝐿 wal Jama'ah in a particular locality. How strong are the people of truth? If they're weak, then them boycotting another individual, what's the effect? What's the impact? Very little. But if they're strong, if they have influence in the society, in the community, then if 𝐻𝐿 was to boycott that individual, that will have an impact on him. He'll feel it. He'll feel, okay, maybe I've done something wrong. But if they're weak, if they're a minority, and who cares if they boycott me or not? It doesn't really matter. There's no impact on that individual. So the strength of 𝐻𝐿 wal Jama'ah. The fifth thing is the knowledge of a person himself. I'm going to boycott that individual. What's my status? If I'm strong in knowledge, perhaps I can sit with him and try to explain, and perhaps there's benefit in me trying to explain to him. But if I'm weak in knowledge and I fear that if I sit with him I might fall for his deception, then for me individually, as an individual now, it's better for me to avoid him. So now I also look to myself, my own personal circumstances. Right? What are my personal circumstances? I don't want to fall into misguidance. I don't want to fall into sin. I don't want to be tempted by this individual. If I feel that I'm weak, it's better for me to stay away. But if I feel that I'm strong enough to advise him, then perhaps it's better for me to, approach him and advise that individual. And they also talk about location and time. Consider the location where you are. And also consider the time when you are. And it may well be that, the customs of an location, the way that people think in a particular location, the strength of innovations and sin in a particular location, all of these will have an impact on whether you would determine whether you would boycott that individual or not. So as you can see, a number of steps have to be taken before we make this judgment call, this decision to boycott an individual. We can't just jump to it straight away. And often, especially amongst our circles, when we talk about boycotting, we frequently talk about boycotting people of innovation, people of bid'ah. But even with bid'ah, we have to look at the type of innovation that person is doing. Because innovation is of many different categories. Innovation itself is of different types of categories. We have innovation in belief. We have innovation in deed. And an innovation in belief is more severe than an innovation in belief, in deed, right? A person who believes, for example, you can go to the dead and ask them for help is not the same as a person who's performing a mawlid, for example. These are not the same level of innovation. We have to differentiate between the two. We have to be fair and just. A person who's committing an innovation which is disbelief is not the same as a person who's committing an innovation which is not disbelief, right? A person who believes that crying out or making dua to the dead is allowed is not the same as a person who is having certain types of innovation in certain categories of dhikr, for example, right? These are not the same. You don't judge them as the same. A person who has innovation, which is a universal innovation, as opposed to a partial innovation, right? There's another category. What's a universal innovation? A universal innovation is an innovation in a foundational aspect of Islam that impacts pretty much every area of Islam. Whereas a partial innovation is one that's not like that. An example of this, what's a universal innovation? Someone who believes that his intellect overrides revelation. My reasoning, my aql, judges revelation. Revelation is subservient to my aql. This is a foundational innovation because it impacts everything, right? It impacts every area of Islam. It impacts how he looks at the scripture. Someone who's got an innovation like this can never be regarded as someone who is, as I said, celebrating Mawlid. Can never be regarded as the same as someone who is doing certain types of dhikr here and there, or doing the whirling dervishes or whatever. These are just not the same. Someone who's got the innovation of rejecting hadith. This is a universal innovation. Why? Because it impacts every area of Islam. Cannot be regarded ever the same as someone who has lesser types of innovation. Someone who is Sunni, a person of Ahl-Sunnah wal Jama'ah, but he's made a mistake of ijtihad. He's generally made a mistake in falling into innovation. Such a person cannot be treated the same as the Khawarij or the Jahmiyyah or the Mu'tazila. They're just not the same. Someone who's an ignorant person, a muqallid, a blind follower, who's following people he trusts, and the people he trusts as people of knowledge are teaching innovation, how can you treat him the same as a person who's calling to innovation, for example, right? A person of knowledge calling to innovation. These can never be the same. Right? So if you look, even even when we talk about boycotting people of bid'ah, there's so much detail we have to go through before we make this conclusion. Because we have to look at the type of innovation and the severity of that innovation and the impact of that innovation and the extent of that innovation in Islam before we make the judgment call. And that's why when we look to the Salaf, or rather before we do that, so therefore, is it correct, and this is an unfortunate mistake many people do, they read statements of the Salaf very harsh against people of innovation, very strict against people of innovation. But who are the innovators they're talking about? They're talking about innovators who are guilty of kufr in their innovations. They're talking about innovators whose innovation was universal. It impacted everything. you can't apply those statements to innovators or people who've got innovation who are not of that level at all. It's unfair, it's unjust. And therefore, when we look to the Salaf as a whole and see how they dealt with people of innovation, you find it's far more nuanced and far more detailed than some people make it out to be. So for example, you find some people deciding to imprison or punish people who committed innovation from the Salaf. You find some cases where they would prohibit sitting with people of innovation. You'd find some cases where they would actually argue and debate. They would go to them and sit with them. So some of them would prohibit sitting with them. Some would actually go and sit with them and argue and debate with them. You find some of the Salaf actually deciding to fight them, open war with them. You find some of them openly defending the Sunnah, like Imam Ahmad, for example, openly calling to the Sunnah and openly defending the Sunnah. And you find cases where the Salaf would sit with the people of innovation and visit them and be friendly with them. Why? Because they believed that this course of action was better in bringing them back to the truth. So these are different stances that Salaf took based upon the circumstances. And the point of me listing these different actions is to show that they were actually looking at the circumstances and looking at the place and the time and the type of innovation and the effect upon the person that the boycotting would have. So, to conclude the topic of boycotting for today, when we make the judgment call of boycotting, it has to follow there's a process to be followed. There are certain principles, certain factors that have to be determined. And always we have to bear in mind the principles that Allah has outlined in the Quran, which is the overall principle of boycotting. وَلَا تَعَاوَنُوا عَلَى الْإِثْمِ وَالْعُدْوَانِ. Don't help each other towards sin and transgression. When you boycott, don't let that be a means of that person going further into sin and transaction. Allah says, إِنَّمَا الْمُؤْمِنُونَ إِخْوَةٌ فَأَصْلِحُوا بَيْنَ أَخَوَيْكُمْ. The believers are brothers. So bring about reconciliation, bring about betterment between your brothers. Bring about the betterment between your brothers. And this is the goal of boycotting all the time. The bringing them back to the truth. Or at the very least saving ourselves, if we fear us as individuals, saving ourselves from their evil, if we fear that we might fall for their evil. And we'll stop there for today. Subhanaka wa bihamdika ashhadu an la ilaha illa anta astaghfiruka wa atubu ilayk.